The Japanese Mega Drive saw its fair share of games that were never released in other regions. There were shoot-'em-ups like Eliminate Down. This one had some fantastic cinematics, killer graphics, and a pretty decent soundtrack. There was also Battlemania 2, the sequel to what was also known as Troubleshooter. It was a strange game that had two women hooked together and attacking in unison. It too looked and sounded pretty good. Advanced Buster Hawk Glaylancer not only has a really cool name, but was also one heck of a shoot-'em-up. Like the previous two mentions, you just had to love those beautiful visuals and excellent FM soundtrack. Two-dimensional shooters weren't the only great Mega Drive exclusive games native to the Japanese shore. Monster World 4 looked like it belonged on the Super Nintendo, with its bright, colorful graphics and upbeat soundtrack. The Japanese Mega Drive even gave us the forward-scrolling action of Panorama Cotton. While it wasn't as smooth as the arcade games of its type, it still was an excellent example of what the hardware was capable of. I was especially impressed with the music in this one. But of all the games for the Japanese Mega Drive that were not released in the West, I think the one that piqued my interest the most was 1994's Pulseman. On the surface, it looked like a Mega Man ripoff with electrical powers. But could this Game Freak developed action platformer be something more? Perhaps even something special? In this episode, we are going to take a look at Pulseman for the Japanese Mega Drive and see if it's the masterpiece I always wanted it to be. The story is your typical Japanese craziness. A computer scientist falls in love with an artificial intelligence and they have a son together, the titular Pulseman. Unfortunately for Pulseman's human father, the transfer into the digital world corrupts his mind, and once he's back in the real world, he sets out to conquer it. Yep, you have to defeat your own dad in this one. But seeing how Pulseman is a mix of human DNA and computer technology, he is not ill-prepared for this fight. You have the ability to control electricity to a degree, and can exist in both the human and digital worlds at will. The platform-heavy gameplay relies on melee attacks, projectiles, and a bit of puzzle solving as you make your way through its 7 stages. Pulseman has a standard melee attack, a low melee kick, and a flash kick that hits enemies above him. He also has the ability to build up a charge by running, which automatically kicks in once you build up speed. This puts Pulseman in a sparkling state, which gives you a few new options. If you are sparkling, your standard melee punch turns into a devastating projectile attack that goes all the way across the screen. You also have the option to perform a Voltecker, or what is essentially Pulseman blasting diagonally upwards as a pure ball of energy. This is both an attack and a means of conveyance. In tight quarters, this will bounce you around quite a bit, allowing you to get to areas you couldn't with the standard jump. The sparkling state also can be achieved with the dash. This becomes an important move because you can sparkle in tight quarters or when you need it immediately, which is mandatory on some of the more difficult areas and boss encounters. Pulseman's life is noted by the gauge in the upper left-hand corner. It has 3 states. Blue means you are fine, yellow means you have taken damage, and red means you are about to die. While you are exploring your surroundings, you may see some different items that you can collect. 10 spark balls, or the little round electrical symbols, are what you need to get an extra life. If you run across a heart icon, that gives you one of your hit points back. The large electrical symbols are Voltec power-ups, which allow you to stay charged up the entire stage. There are also 1-ups hidden around as well. The stages here vary in design and purpose. Some are straightforward left to right affairs where you are just killing enemies. Some are more puzzle-esque in nature and have maze elements. A few scroll vertically up and down. Stages are chosen at your discretion. You can choose the order of the first 3 stages, and once those are defeated, you can choose the order of the next 3 before opening the final area. The comparison to Mega Man is not without merit, but it feels very different from Capcom's Little Blue Bomber in practice. Pulseman is a really nice looking game. I'd even go so far as to say it's beautiful. Nearly every stage has great color, background effects like parallax and line scrolling, and even some really nice transparency tiles that come across pretty impressive for hardware not known to do it very often. Pulseman himself is large, well detailed, and animated like a champ, as are his enemies and bosses. Some of the special effects are mind-blowing and really give the stages a great sense of three-dimensional space. The strength of this engine is clearly its variety, however. Every area is loaded with multiple levels that all tend to look completely different from one another. There are cities, forests, ancient ruins, snow-covered mountains, and water areas to explore. You even go inside computers from time to time. This is 16 megabits of ROM that is used quite well. The only real weakness visually is the engine seems to suffer from slowdown frequently. You feel things struggle from time to time, particularly when things shatter or there is a large sprite on the screen. While it is noticeable enough to be an irritant here and there, it doesn't ruin the game and is adjusted to fairly easily. The bottom line is Pulseman has the color, backgrounds, and special effects to impress even the most jaded Genesis owner. It stands among 16-bit juggernauts like Rocket Knight Adventures and holds its own. That's no small thing and a credit to the developers. Much like the variety in the stages, Pulseman has a huge selection of musical tracks, and boy does it range in the type of stuff you'll hear. Some are fast, some are slow, and some are little more than whispers of environmental effects. There is a fair bit of digitized speech here as well. I can't possibly do the soundtrack any real justice in this tiny review, so here are a few random choices for your listening pleasure. There is an undeniable pleasure in Pulseman's gameplay. The simple thrills of launching yourself around a stage has to be experienced to understand fully. Most stages are large and give you plenty of room to play around in. And the real hook of this is just how much fun you have with that. While you do have traditional attacks and enemies to use them against, the environment itself tends to be your biggest challenge. Enemies are more of an occasional nuisance and sometimes don't show up at all. And that there is the question that begs to be answered. Can you enjoy a game where the stage itself is your biggest threat? Nearly all of the challenge you'll face here comes in the form of how the stages are laid out. Most of it is manageable with a little trial and error, but some of it is just plain cheap. There is a level in this that is entirely blind drops, for instance, and it'll likely eat up multiple lives and continues before you memorize its layout. But even then, you will memorize the pattern, and then the stage is no threat at all. Worse, there isn't a single enemy in this game that poses much of a challenge. Most are slow, and many are stationary, basically setting ducks for you to unload on and kill easily. That does take its toll on Pulseman's fun factor. There are moments of real coolness here, but you rarely ever feel threatened. What could have been genuine moments of badassery are instead moments of just getting from point A to point B without falling on spikes or dropping into those bottomless pits. That sort of makes Pulseman a contentious experience. Some will love the freedom of movement, while others will crave more enemies to unleash their fury upon. You can see this disparity in the reviews of the era as well. Most publications were extremely divided on its quality. Some loved the platforming and stage design, while others lamented its lack of action and enemies. This made Pulseman appear to be of lower quality than I feel it deserves. I agree 100% it could have used more combat situations to balance out the environmental dangers, but I also think the core gameplay is loaded with appeal. What it does, it certainly does well, and should provide many of you quite the memorable experience. As I mentioned before, this was developed by Game Freak, the very same company that would go on to do the incredibly popular Pokemon titles. In fact, Pokemon for the Game Boy was their very next release, and many of the core team worked on both titles. Contrary to popular belief, Pulseman did see availability in the United States. Sega released the Japanese version on its Sega Channel service in 1995, though no physical cartridge was ever produced. As you can imagine, a Japanese Mega Drive release in 1994 was done in very limited quantities, so if you want to own Pulseman today, boy are you gonna pay a small fortune for it. It was available on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console service for a time, but that has since been shut down. That means if you want to play Pulseman today legitimately, your options aren't so desirable. Fortunately, emulation comes to the rescue again, and there is even a fan translation out there that makes the story a bit more palatable for English-speaking audiences. While I do admit that Pulseman has a number of things that needs improvement, I also recognize the power it has in its core design. Running, jumping, and volticking yourself around these stages with their excellent graphics is more than enough reason for me to recommend it. Some of you may come away wanting more, but I think most of you will still find it worth a playthrough. Sega really should have released this in the West. In 1994, they had stinkers like Young Indiana Jones and Disney's Bonkers under their banner, and this puts those games to shame. It's no masterpiece and certainly won't displace the brilliance of the more action-heavy titles like Shinobi 3, but it offers a unique adventure still well worth taking. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.